Hello, welcome to week 2. This week we're going to talk about assessing preference, which is an important but often overlooked aspect of behavioral assessment. Generally, when desired behavior change doesn't occur, we tend to look toward one of two things: either that the behavior support plan just isn't working and needs to be modified, or that the behavior support plan or behavior intervention plan is not being implemented the way it was written. And those are two very common reasons that we are not getting the kinds of behavior change that we were desiring to get. However, a third and often much simpler explanation as to why we're not seeing behavior change that, in my experience, people, BCBAs in particular, often overlook is that the stimuli that we are using as reinforcers really aren't functioning as reinforcers, or let me say they are no longer or never were potent reinforcers. Motivation is a critical aspect of applied behavior analysis. And it is one that I think, as our technologies have been developing, that we've started to overlook is the value of motivation and reinforcement. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how do we assess stimuli to determine whether in fact they are potent reinforcers. So there's determining appropriate reinforcers can certainly be difficult. Sometimes because the items that you know or you think you know are potent reinforcers, motivating to the individual, you just can't use as frequently as you'd like. Examples of that might be certain kinds of edible reinforcers, ice cream, M&Ms, that aren't very healthy, and therefore they're not the kinds of reinforcers that ethically you could use on a regular basis. Sometimes it's just difficult to identify with some individuals what exactly is a reinforcer. And I think the third reason is that reinforcers change. Sometimes we overlook that. We think that, well, because this individual liked this 6 months ago or a year ago or 2 years ago, that they still like doing that. Well, think about yourself. Your reinforcers change. You don't necessarily like to do the same things that you did yesterday or the day before or last year or last month. And the individuals we work with are the same. I would say some of the most challenging cases that I have ever worked on, a common denominator is that these are individuals that their reinforcers changed rapidly and without a lot of notice. So what was a reinforcer last week isn't necessarily a reinforcer today, or what was a reinforcer yesterday isn't a reinforcer right now. Or in some cases, and these are really tough, what was a reinforcer 20 minutes ago is not a reinforcer now. Something else is. And so that means we need to have very effective ways of determining what actually functions as a reinforcer. So there's several ways of doing this. One way, there's informal assessments, which is observation. Now, that's always a good classic. Watch the person and observe and see what are reinforcers. That can be very effective, but it's also somewhat limiting, because at that time that you're watching, if you're just observing, then the person only has access to limited things at that particular time. So you may not be able to really assess what stimuli are most motivating or most reinforcing for that individual. When appropriate, you certainly could ask the individual. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Um, what do you like? What would you like to work for? And I've had some success with that. I know other people have had success, but sometimes that really can fail too, because oftentimes what people say are their reinforcers aren't necessarily true. For example, many of us, if someone asks, well, what do you like to do? Or, how do you like to spend your free time? You're going to say something that's probably more, that you wish was more true or more socially acceptable, like spend time with my family, read a good book, go on a nature walk, exercise. When, in fact, if you look at your time and how you spend your time, if you get free time, maybe what you enjoy the most is getting some junk food and watching reality television. But people aren't going to tend to report that. So sometimes interviewing the individual can be very useful, but sometimes it doesn't. What they say isn't necessarily what is the most reinforcing. And another way is to interview staff or caregivers and ask them what they think an individual's reinforcer is. Again, sometimes that can be very useful, but there's a lot of literature out there to support that a lot of times that isn't true. And in my own experience, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, when I ask caregivers what is reinforcing to an individual, what they typically tell me is what is reinforcing to them. So self-reports may be poor, caregiver reports may be inaccurate. So in order to sort of test this out for myself, several years ago, I did this informal study because we were working with an individual, let's call her Sheila, and Sheila had pretty severe behavior problems. She had a non-traumatic brain injury. She probably intellectually had a severe intellectual disability, but she could talk. And she certainly would tell you what she wanted. And we had found that mixing in with various other positive reinforcers that we used, that edible reinforcers were really very potent. And so the problem was that the staff kept moving toward these, she was putting on weight, and the staff were moving toward these really high calorie, high fat items. And so I was hoping we could try to find some more appropriate items that would still function as reinforcers for her. Now, of course, the staff were telling me, no, there's no way. She's only going to go for potato chips, and they had several other things that were even worse than potato chips. So that's why I decided, well, let's look at this systematically. So what we did was we had 3 types of preference assessments were conducted. One, I asked the staff, who, by the way, had worked with her at that point for 5 or 6 years, so they certainly had a lot of experience with Sheila. Asked them to rank several snack foods in order of perceived preference. Asked Sheila, who, as I mentioned, she could talk and would tell you what she liked, laid them or discussed all of the potential snack foods to her and asked her which she would like, just describing them to her. And then we did a formal preference assessment. So here's the results of the teachers, which is the lighter color. Gosh, I don't know what color that is. Let's call it purple. Um, and how they rated from 1 to 6, each of these 6 items. And then we have Sheila's reports, which is, well, I'm going to call that a darker purple, that and how she rated it. The point is that there's no correlation here at all. So, for example, as predicted, the staff all absolutely said the number one ranking, the thing that Sheila would like the most, are potato chips. Well, not according to Sheila. According to Sheila, number one were these cheese pretzels, and in fact, she didn't even select the potato chips, so they were 0. So then we did a simple multiple stimulus with replacement systematic preference assessment. Now, I want to emphasize how simple and easy, if you haven't done one of these, this is. So what we would do is for each session, or each trial rather, we would take each of the 6 items and lay them out. Now that order would change to counterbalance a preference based on where the item was rather than it's the item. So we moved them around, so we would indicate where everything was at any given time, but the items were always called cheese pretzels, for example, was always item 1. Honey nut checks was always item number 6. So we'd lay out all 6 and say, Sheila, pick one. She would reach over, grab it. She'd have 5 seconds to consume it, which she only really needed 1 or 2 seconds to consume it. It was a small amount of each of those. We would replace it, reverse the order, and do it again. So in this case, we would do 6 trials per session. And you can see for this particular day, well, no matter where we moved the cheese pretzels, she followed them and chose them, except for trial 3, she chose the honey nut checks for this particular one. We did 9 of these sessions of 6 trials. Now, you can see by the way I'm explaining this, this took to do each session, which is 6 trials, this took about a minute. It took more time to go get Sheila and have her come down, and then we kept the food items, laid them out. The whole thing was done in 5 minutes easily. So very quick, very simple. And here's the results of the formal preference assessment, which is really the gold standard, because the other 2 are what people say are going to happen, either Sheila or the staff. This is what Sheila really selected, and we find that she chose the honey nut checks the majority of the time. Cheese pretzels the second to most, which is what she said. And then pita and tabbouleh as the least. By the way, I fall victim to this same problem that I described caregivers do, which is I am the one who decided to put pita and tabbouleh in because, well, I like that. And I assumed that she would. Apparently, once again, I was wrong. She really didn't care for it much at all, but she liked it more than potato chips, so I guess I could feel good about that. So the point is this: there's no correlation here between what Sheila really chose and what the staff said and what Sheila actually chose herself. So the bottom line is that when you're looking at this, there's no correlation. that the preference preference assessment, which is the gold standard, was not correlated with either one, and therefore, asking, at least in this case, asking staff or asking Sheila would have gotten us off down a dark alley. If we would have used those as reinforcers, they very well may not have been effective. Additionally, this particular intervention was so simple and so easy that it was actually used. Staff started using it themselves after we finished with this study, informal study, as a reinforcer, because Sheila would ask to do it. I think they called it taste testing or something. And she enjoyed the whole process so much that it actually sort of became a reinforcer for her to come and do this whole taste testing, even though we weren't collecting the data anymore. It was just a process that she enjoyed. So that's my other point, is that a systematic preference assessment can just be a very positive experience, a positive way to interact with individuals. Because, heck, who doesn't like being involved in a situation where we're going to lay out all the things that you think I like and let me choose a couple of them and interact with them? So, all right. So there are essentially 4 types of systematic preference assessments. Single stimulus, paired stimulus, multiple stimulus, and free operant. And those are all reflected by the 4 studies that you were reading this week. So the first one in 1985, the PACE study, is what was the first one, the first systematic preference assessment. And 16 items were assessed. Now, that's a lot of items, and I would not recommend you try to do that. But the idea was to try to sample across several different sensory categories. I think over the years I've learned just trying to come up with what people think might be reinforcers and assessing some of those together. And a smaller number is a much more useful way to go. But so in any case, the original study used 16. But what's most important is that the dependent measure was approach. So basically, and all of these studies essentially use that as the dependent measure of assessing whether something is a reinforcer. So essentially, a common denominator of all of these studies is the stimulus item, the potential reinforcer, is placed in front of the individual. If they approach that, and that could be operationally defined for each person, then that is what constitutes a preference. And in this first study, we said you had to approach it at least 80% of the trials, and that's pretty much what people have stuck with, is 80% is a preference. So once you've established a preference, now of course you have to determine whether that preference really functions as a reinforcer. That is, will someone engage in a behavior in order to get it? So all of these studies, and this first one in particular, sort of looked at behaviors that were exhibited at low rates, but they occurred, and trying to see if you could increase them with when the items that were identified as preferred relative to ones that were identified as non-preferred, or in a baseline condition where there were no consequences. If you get more responding during the preferred when it's contingent upon a preferred stimulus, then of course that suggests that in fact your preferred items are functioning as reinforcers. And that's in fact what this first study did by using a reversal design. So the results suggested that contingent use of preferred stimuli increased target responses above that of baseline in non-preferred. Great. So this was the first study that really showed that a systematic preference assessment can be useful. Problems were the length of the assessment. It took a long time to do this study. Now, part of that was because so many stimuli were used. But the biggest problem is false positives. That is that you engaged in this single stimulus preference assessment lends itself to individuals approaching items that really aren't that reinforcing, and probably because the response effort is so slim. You know, a great example of this is something that just happened to me. I was at a doctor's appointment, sitting in a doctor's office, and all the good magazines were gone, and all that was left were, you know, a couple of women's magazines and some magazine about buying real estate or something. So, you know, I picked up the real estate magazine and looked through it. So I guess from my own definition of what is a preference, one could say, well, gee, I prefer reading about how to buy and sell real estate, when in fact I really could care less about that, and I know nothing about that. But given the low response effort, there was nothing else for me to do. That would be a false positive. One might say, oh, look, he likes real estate magazines. But that's not really true. It's just, it was a low response effort. It was just something to do. And I picked it up and looked at that. So that was a problem with these false positives with the single stimulus, is that you were identifying too many other items that probably weren't all that reinforcing. Yeah, you know, for the small response effort of the arbitrary response of maybe raising your hand up, fine, I'll work for these Cheerios, but I really don't care that much about Cheerios, potentially. All right, the second study that you're reading, the Fisher study in '92, attempted to address that particular problem of false positives. And the way they addressed it is that instead of having a single stimulus, they had paired stimuli. So they used two stimuli at the same time. And so now it's not just, well, there's not much of a response effort. All I have to do is raise my hand and you'll give me that. It's now, okay, between these two, which one do I like the most? And so what Fisher did is had included every combination and permutation of the two items together, then looked at all of those data, and therefore what they found basically was that in fact there were less false positives with the paired stimulus approach than with the single stimulus approach. That's great. The problem was, now that length of assessment was really long, because now you have to take each item, if you even have 6 items, and you have to come up with pairing each item with every other item. You need multiple trials of each of those, and boy, you know, you're looking at quite a bit of time, 45 minutes or so, 30 minutes, depending on the number of items that you're looking at, in order to, and the number of times that you have to present them again to get clean data. That for each session, and then running multiple sessions, that can take a long time. You're talking about a long time to do a preference assessment. So the length of the assessment was the biggest problem with the paired stimulus. So to address that, multiple stimulus preference assessments came about. So Windsor in '94 came up with essentially what I just demonstrated with Sheila to you that we did with Sheila. Now this is really simple. 6 items presented together on each trial, just like I did with Sheila. And they did 10 trials for each session. We did 6, I think. And they did 5 sessions. I did 9. But the point is, it doesn't take very long to do those, and you're talking about a total of 50 trials as opposed to a total of 150 trials with the paired stimulus. So it's essentially 3 times shorter, and they got similar results. So that's a positive. The negative of these multiple, or shortcoming of these multiple stimulus assessments, is that now you can get false negatives. That is, that there may be some items that can function as potent reinforcers, but you didn't identify them. Why? Well, because you're replacing that item each time. So Sheila, for example, maybe the pita and tabuli, I'm still hoping that I was right, could function as a viable reinforcer, a potent reinforcer, but she did like the cheese pretzels, or whatever she chose, the Chex, whatever it was, the number one was, I forget now. She did like that one the most, but because that was available on every trial, she just kept choosing that one, but there were some other items that may function as reinforcers. Well, if what you're looking for is the most potent reinforcer, well then I'd say the multiple stimulus with replacement is a great procedure because it's so quick and so easy. But if what you're really looking for is a ranking of stimuli, items that are potent reinforcers, well, then this multiple stimulus condition may not be the best for you. So you might want to try the multiple stimulus without replacement. De Leon and Awada in '96 came up with this one. So this is essentially the same as the multiple stimulus, except as the name implies, you don't replace the item after it's taken. So you continue until there are no items remaining, or the individual does not select any of the remaining items. The individuals then have to select between the less preferred items. And so now you can get a ranking. So they compared the multiple stimulus without replacement to the multiple stimulus and to the paired stimulus, and found that the multiple stimulus method was associated with more unselected items than either the multiple stimulus without replacement or the paired stimulus, and that in fact that the items that were missed with the multiple stimulus multiple stimulus preference assessment, that those items did in fact function as reinforcers. They also found that the paired stimulus method was on average more than twice as long as the multiple stimulus without replacement. Okay, you got that? All right, so as I said, so those items, so there were false negatives with the multiple stimulus without replacement essentially eliminated that problem and was able to identify 3 out of 4 items that weren't picked up by the multiple stimulus did in fact function as reinforcers. Now, criticisms of this one, well, again, it depends what you want. There really aren't any. If you want to get a ranking of items, then this one is certainly going to be the best. If you don't care about ranking and you just care about finding the most potent quickly and easily, which was the case for me with Sheila, then just the multiple stimulus works. But it's really more of your own preference. Both of these, I think, are quite good. And then finally, we have the free operant. Now, and that came out in 98. And so Rohn and Associates looked at this. This is probably the most straightforward of all of them, which is simply taking multiple stimuli. In their case, in the study you're going to read or read, they used 10 stimuli. Present them in front of the person, collect data for 5 minutes, and just look at, now instead of approach necessarily, it's object manipulation was recorded. So they put the items in front of the person for 5 minutes and just record which item do they interact with the most, or the amount of time that they interact with each one. They compared the items that were selected 80% of the time or more with the ones that weren't, and found that those that were selected as preferences by the free operant did in fact function as reinforcers. And then they also compared it to the paired preference assessment, and basically found, which I find so interesting, that the duration of the paired stimulus was almost 22 minutes, versus, of course, theirs took 5 minutes. And if you think, you have to do one of these every day for a while in order to get some stability, that's quite a difference in time. So essentially, the criticisms again are of this one is that, again, you can get false negatives, because if you lay out all of the items and one of those items is overwhelmingly reinforcing, the individual might spend all their time with that one. There may be other ones that they're not interacting with that you're not noting as being preferences that in fact are preferences. So again, like the multiple stimulus, it doesn't produce a ranking. And then this last point is something that's worth talking about, which is the method of assessing preferences may favor some stimuli over others. And what I mean by that is that, when you think about how the free operant is different than the first three that we talked about. The first three, it was basically approach, interact with it, and then move on. This one, you have 5 minutes to interact with it completely. So I think that some stimuli are going to be more reinforcing in one of those settings than another. So for example, if it's a gaming system, so you're playing a game on your phone or on a computer, probably having 5 or 10 seconds access, if that gaming system is sitting on the table, the individual approaches it and starts to play it, and they get 10 seconds and then taken away. Well, that's not going to be much fun, playing Angry Birds for 10 seconds. However, if you get 5 minutes, that's going to lend itself to choosing some of those things, reinforcers that you really need to spend more time with, more of a duration with, than something like food or another kind of stimulus that you can just enjoy in 5 seconds and then move on to the next one. All right, finally, there was a study recently done in BAP, Behavior Analysis in Practice, in 2012 by Graf and Karsten, that surveyed people about CBAs, about preference assessments, and did they really do them? Because now we know we have them. We have all these data that suggest that these preference assessments, systematic preference assessments, are generally better. But do people really do them? My sense is they don't. And so this study I thought was really interesting. And so they surveyed 406 individuals. 90% of the BCBAs said they have administered at least one systematic preference assessment, which kind of surprised me. But okay, one. The most common, this really surprised me, is the paired. I'll get back to that in a minute. Now, the vast majority of people said, yeah, they don't do them regularly and they know they should. So BCBA supposedly said, yeah, we know we should be doing these more frequently, but we don't. 19% of those who said, I know I should be doing more of these, but I don't, said they don't do more because of a lack of knowledge. Well, shame on them. You guys don't have that excuse now. Now, this is what I find so interesting, which is 81% reported that they don't do them more often because of lack of time, that they take too much time. Well, then why the heck do you do paired ones, which take the most amount of time? Why don't you do multiple stimulus? Or free operant assessments if in fact time is what's more important. And again, I want to get back to the point with Sheila, is that was done really simply. Those sessions were completed within a matter of minutes. It took more time to set them up and more time to go get Sheila and bring her to the room where we had them set up and then bring her back. So there really shouldn't be an excuse of there's not enough time when in fact, reinforcers and making sure you have reinforcers is probably one of the most important things you can do in terms of a really good assessment. And having a procedure, I think, that you can do briefly and quickly is very important for those individuals that maybe, I have done preference assessments with people every time before. We would every day and maybe twice a day. But if you're doing ones that take a few minutes, you certainly can do that. It might be worth your while and worth your time. So I guess the point of all of this is that there are several different ways of doing systematic preference assessments. Some have different advantages and disadvantages over others. But the important thing is that sometimes they're really valuable to do. And so there really shouldn't be an excuse. And don't be one of these guys who says you don't know enough about them. And don't be one of these guys who say you don't have enough time. Try them. So next week, we're going to be back to a face-to-face class, and we're going to have student and instructor presentations on indirect behavioral assessments. But in the beginning of next week's class, I want to have a discussion about your own experiences with systematic preference assessments and preference assessments in general and how you guys do it. And if you have time between the time that we get together next week and now, and you haven't done a preference assessment and it's possible to do it in the environment you're in, do one. I would love to hear what your experiences are, and I think you'd be surprised. So that's what I'm challenging you to do. If you've done them, great. I want to talk about them. If you haven't, do one or attempt to do one, and we will talk about them in the beginning of class next week. Have a good week, and I will see you.